Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this important event. My name is Peter Stonham. I'm the Chairman of Landor Links and Editorial Director of Local Transport Today, and I very much enjoyed putting together the programme with my colleagues and partners for the event. As you're obviously aware, we've sadly switched from a physical face-to-face event, which would have been in the relaxing surroundings of Regent's Park, to this online format. It isn't a brand new step for us because the platform we're employing today was used extensively to good effect during the pandemic lockdowns. The housekeeping announcements are very simple, as there will be no scheduled fire alarm today, and any bells you hear ringing will be entirely your own responsibility. One advantage of the online format is that we have been able to have many more people involved, and there are around 150 signed up to attend today from an excellent range of local authorities and other professionals engaged in local transport planning and delivery. We're very keen on audience participation, but we have only the capability to put the presenters and panelists on screen individually, and therefore I would invite anyone else to use the chat facility on this hop-in platform to make comments and raise questions as the day progresses, and our team will put them together and feed them to the chairs to ask the panels and to have discussion. We've got an excellent lineup of speakers, and I'm really confident that today's discussion will add a lot of knowledge and insight to the process of re-energising the LTP programme. May I thank our partners for their involvement and support, obviously the Department for Transport, who will be in both presenting and listening mode today, and our sponsors, the Urban Transport Group, Project Centre and Atkins, who I'd like to thank for helping us make this day possible. Now, without further ado, I'd invite first Jonathan Bray, the Director of the Urban Transport Group, and following him, Stephen Fidler, Co-Director of Local Transport at the DFT, to say their own few words of welcome. So over to you, Jonathan.
Thanks, Peter, and good morning, everybody. Delighted that local transport plans are making a comeback. It's long overdue, and if we are to decarbonise at pace, then we need that coordinated overall plan for doing this. So very pleased we've been able to sponsor today's event. Two things I wanted to say while I've got the mic. For me, the problem with too many LTPs in the past was that they said all the right things around sustainability in the text, but when you looked in the annex of where the money was going to be spent, there were too many road schemes that have been around for a very long time, swallowing up too much of the available funding with too little impact compared with what else you could do with that funding. Or to use a chocolate bar metaphor, the wrapping looked great, but when you bit into it, you were biting into a lot of concrete and tarmac. So I'm hoping in the next generation of LTPs, the text and the annex will be seamless and coherent and built around the urgent task we all have of decarbonising local transport. The second thing is that we get the balance right between national direction and devolved decision making. Government, of course, has the right to say the policies, the national policies, it wants to see reflected and delivered. But at the same time, it's when urban areas are given their head that we've seen the biggest and fastest leaps forward, like more accessible public transport, road pricing, zero emission public service fleets, and many more innovations besides. And for this to happen, devolution needs to be real. But I'll end there. I'm really looking forward to today's discussion and onwards and upwards.
Thanks very much, Jonathan. And now I'd like to invite Stephen Fidler from the Department of Transport to say a few words too.
Thank you very much, Peter, and thank you everybody for coming today, and to Landor for pulling this event together, and indeed their sponsors. From my perspective, this is a really, really important session. I look at local transport plans and their kind of revitalisation as very much the cornerstone of all the work that we're doing in DFT on local transport. We've done some good stuff, in my view, around active travel and around buses and continually on local roads. But if we don't pull that, as Jonathan was saying, together into things that add up to the sum of their parts, then it really feels like we're missing opportunities. And at one level, it's kind of really understandable when we change the framework, change the rules a good few years ago now, that well over half of local transport authorities didn't really have an up-to-date local transport plan that had been looked at in the past few years. But from where we're sitting, that poses some real challenges. It becomes really tricky for us to understand how individual investments add up to some of their parts, and we keep asking for more and more information when we do funding. It makes it actually quite hard for us to make the case for the right quantity of local transport investment if we don't know what the plan and the vision and the intention is in each local transport authority. And actually it makes it hard for us to fund and support the right things, or to know how everything really works together as a package. But perhaps more importantly than that, as Jonathan was saying, if we're to really tackle some of the key challenges that we face as government and as local government, particularly I'm thinking of net zero and levelling up, we really do need that local, up-to-date, coherent plan that really interfaces with everything beyond transport. Because of course, as you all know better than me, transport is not an end in its own right. It's really about contributing to local growth. It's about contributing to decarbonisation. It's about meeting the needs of local communities and people. And that's why in the Transport Decarbonisation Plan and in several other of our strategies, we did it in Bus Back Better, we did it in Gear Change as well. We really made that commitment to revitalise local transport plans. And in the Transport Decarbonisation Plan, we made it clear that we really see quantifiable carbon reduction as sitting at the heart of this as a fundamental plan. And before I end, I just want to sort of share a quick anecdote. A couple of years ago, we funded quite a few cycling and active travel projects, but one local authority exec director chatted to me at an event shortly afterwards and was telling me how he was absolutely delighted to have got this funding. But actually that corridor really should have been a bus lane. But the local situation meant we did a cycling and active travel funding competition. His local members wanted him to apply for that money. That's what it needed to be, because that's what was on the table. I think if we get this right on local transport planning, that sort of thing won't happen again. We'll understand the impact. We'll know whether we're funding a thing that's the right intervention in the right place. And actually those conversations locally with members will be different too. So I hope if we support you in this and we get the balance between our role and local authorities' role right, this will work well for all of us. And on that note, I'm really conscious there's a wealth of experience in this virtual room. And as Peter said at the beginning, we are here in both sort of sharing our thinking, but very, very much listening mode as well, because there's a lot for us to learn from local transport authorities and other experts and professionals. So please share your advice and wisdom. We'll be listening. And there are now two of us leading local transport directorate. So my colleague, Jessica Matthew, who's my co-director and likely perhaps leading on more of this than I am going forwards, is going to be back at the end of the day to offer some further thoughts and reflections. So thank you very much indeed, Peter, and I hope everybody has a great day.
Thank you very much, Stephen. Thank you very much, Jonathan. Now it's time to begin the day's presentations and discussions, and I'm delighted that Professor Peter Jones agreed to provide the keynote overview of the evolution of the local transport plans from the past and some of the issues he believes are core to tackling the next generation of them. So I'd now like to welcome Peter Jones to give the first presentation.
Thank you very much, Peter, and good morning, everybody. What I'd like to do is to cover three topics briefly. First of all, the history of where LTPs have come from and where they've got to, taking stock about where we are now and what we need, and then some of the things we might do moving forward. And it's a very rich area. I'm just going to take a few examples. So first of all, the history of LTPs. Well, before LTPs, obviously there were relationships between local authorities and central government. And the local highway authority in the Met areas between 74 and 98 was the district councils and county councils in the Shire. And we had passenger transport was coordinated by the Shire counties and passenger transport executives in the Met counties. At that time, the local highway authorities had to submit annual transport policies and programs. to bid for transport supplementary grant, and also at that time for permission to borrow money. And major schemes were funded individually, subject to a cost-benefit analysis, whereas minor schemes were funded under a block grant allocation. But as Jonathan said, that was very much primarily around bidding for road schemes, actually, but very much on a scheme-by-scheme basis. And there was increasing pressure to actually say we need to take a more integrated approach, that has been talked about already. So in the early 1990s, the West Midlands pioneered what was known as the package approach, where rather than bidding for individual things, the vision and the set of connected measures necessary to live that vision were put together, and the bid was made for that package. And then if you move on to this century, 2001 to 2006, New Deal for Transport and the Transport Act 2000 introduced formally 5-year local transport plans, replacing the annual TPP submission, with the remit to cover all forms of transport and the full range of delivery mechanisms available for pursuing a comprehensive set of objectives. And LTPs had to set out a set of objectives, problems and opportunities, a long-term strategy, a costed and affordable 5-year implementation program, and a set of targets and performance indicators. This was funded through the Integrated Transport Block Grant, and there was annual progress report. And then 2006 to 2011, we then had 4 shared central and local government priorities: congestion, accessibility, safer roads, and air quality. Accessibility planning became an important element of that, understanding that transport was there to link people to places. The previous concern was funding was only on a project by project and annual basis. This gave 5-year block grant funding, and monitoring was done on a longer term. And then there was a new formula set out for indicating how the allocation of the integrated transport block grant would be spread among those 4 priority objectives. Subsequent to that, since 2011, we first of all had a Local Transport Act in 2008 that introduced a new statutory framework for local transport plans. And in 2009, we had guidance issued for Local Transport Plan Round 3. Although authorities still were encouraged to have a cycle, it didn't have to be strictly 5 years. It could depend on local circumstances. And other elements were introduced, separating strategy implementation plans. The separate bus strategy was integrated in the LTP, and the MET PTAs became the integrated transport authorities responsible for LTPs. And now we had 5 national transport goals: economic growth, reduce carbon, promote equality, safety, security and health, quality of life, and healthy natural environment. However, with a change of government in 2011, there was a big focus on getting rid of red tape and reducing bureaucracy. So the government regional offices were closed, and DFT stopped requiring local authorities to produce LTPs. Although, in fact, as Jonathan indicated earlier on, 60% of authorities continued developing LTPs on a voluntary basis, indicating that they did see a value in this, in helping them plan delivery of their strategies, and also as a way of communicating with the department. So that's a very quick sort of overview of what's happened over the last 40 or 50 years. Now, where are we now? Well, a few things I just point out. First of all, we've been on a journey with LTPs, which has partly been an administrative journey, but it's also been a journey related to the fact that local authorities and shire counties and so on have had changing focus and perceptions of what the role and focus of local transport planning is. What's it there to deliver? And these have evolved over time. And I think we've got to a point now where thinking among local authorities has got ahead of the LTV framework that we're familiar with. So we need to play catch up and anticipate future developments. And there are a whole series of pressures for change, including, as I'll mention again in a minute, around governance, pressure for greater devolution of authority and access to resources, and greater cross-sector collaboration, for example. Just briefly refer to this. This is the result of a study we did a few years ago, a European study, but including UK cities, looking at how at different points in time, the policy focus had been different. Sometimes focused around trying to actually accommodate cars in cities or in shires, to a focus on sustainable mobility, recognizing the efficiency and sustainability benefits of that, and then a more recent interest in placemaking, livability, and saying that our towns and cities and villages and so on are really places of social life, economic interaction and so on, and we shouldn't let transport dominate those physical environments. And depending on the particular policy focus at the time, then obviously the types of interventions would be different, from road building under car oriented to actually traffic restraint under focusing on city of places, promoting public realm and promoting street activities. And what we found among our various cities was actually you could see a trajectory over time, and from initially from the 50s, 60s, 70s of the last century, trying to accommodate the car in various ways, to in many areas moving on to focusing on sustainable mobility, going even further to actually actively try and reduce levels of car use and promote livability, whether it's in low traffic neighborhoods or in pedestrianized city centers or wherever. And what we found across Europe was, as that policy focus shift from trying to accommodate the car to actually actively trying to reduce levels of car use, that red line, we also find that that's mirrored by differences in the overall levels of car use and car traffic. So policy and the measures introduced really did relate to and influence levels of car use. And as well as strategically, you can see the impact, I think, quite clearly in this diagram, which is Aldgate Square, just to the east of the city of London, where in the 1960s, they built a very large gyratory, which left this church rather isolated in the middle. And then 4 years ago, most of that road space was taken out. There still is access in the area. There are good cycle networks as well as public transport, but that's been transformed into a community space. And that shows that even with the same physical space, depending on your policy priority, the way you lay out that space, the priorities you give to activities and so on, can make a tremendous difference in how we allocate resources and how our physical spaces look. One of the people we've been working with on a project looking at how we might reallocate road space in order to reflect these new priorities was Transport for London as part of a European project. This shows the A2 coming in from the M25 on the right-hand side up to the Inner Ring Road on the left-hand side. And as is increasingly common, as cities actually think about the importance of their streets as places as well, we've used a two-dimensional classification here, the inner one indicating the importance of that corridor for movement and the outer one indicating the importance of different sections of that corridor as places, economic, social, cultural activity. And on the right-hand side there, you can see the boundary between Transport for London and national highways, which in a sense is completely arbitrary. And I use this as a metaphor in a way for the fact that the other thing that in a sense needs to be brought up to date are our various governance arrangements, whether it's in terms of power in the local area as opposed to nationally, the funding arrangements, and also many authorities I've talked to in moving towards a focus on sustainability and livability have actually said they've had to reorganize their departments internally in order to be able to make that thing work in practice. So I think the governance aspects of this are things that need to be brought up to date as part of the process of redefining what we want from our cities and what role LTPs can play. Briefly, moving forward, there are a whole number of issues. I'm just going to pick on two, and other speakers will pick on others during the day. The first of all is the new kid on the block, if you like, or relatively new, is the idea of carbon zero or carbon net zero, and the need by 2050, or in many cases earlier in our met areas, getting to a point of carbon zero or net carbon zero. And you can see a diagram representation here. The bottom left is where we are now. As you go up vertically, we're heading towards success in achieving our target, which in the case of carbon will be getting to zero. That's going to take place sometime in the future, the gold ellipse there. And there's a trajectory from now the blue bottom left to the gold color top right, with a sort of Goldie arrow going in that direction. But to do that, we have to, as it were, start with the future and then look back, come back to now. In other words, stop backcasting. That's the end point we want. What do we have to do to get there? And there'll be a policy mix involving a whole variety of things, some of which will be physical, regulatory, others of which might involve pricing policies and so on, that we need to introduce at different points in time. To do that over time, we'll need to build institutional capacity. As I'll say in a minute, we need to work with a wider range of stakeholders and also obviously secure necessary financial resources. And this is likely to last over several local transport plan cycles. And there's an equivalent debate going on within the EU, where they have a similar process to local transport plans, which they call sustainable urban mobility plans. And we're working on a project there they have what they call a sump cycle. As you can see, they have 12 steps in producing and implementing their sustainable urban mobility plan. And what we're suggesting is that you'll start off in effect with a initial idea for a transition pathway, say over 30 years, identify within that what can be done in the next 5 to 10 years. That's what then feeds into the sump and potentially the LTP. Having done that and started implementing it, the monitoring and evaluation will feed back into the longer term transition pathway, lead to a revision, and then we'll repeat that through several cycles until we achieve our zero carbon or net zero carbon target. That's one thing. The other thing I want to briefly touch about is that I mentioned that cities, in a sense, have gone through these stages of focusing on the car to mobility, sustainable, and also livability in city of places. We can see increasingly that we're moving into a fourth stage that we can call the integrated city. And examples of this, on the one hand, are mobility as a service. So we're trying to move to a point where, from the customer's point of view, all aspects of mobility services are integrated and available as a one-stop shop. But it also goes into working more closely with other sectors to deliver these ever widening goals that cities and shires are trying to achieve. And as an example, with carbon reduction strategies, increasingly around the World Bank, European Investment Bank, in this country as well, in the West Midlands, for example, they're using a broad framework for strategies to achieve carbon reduction around the idea of avoid, shift, improve. And to do that, it's necessary to work with a whole variety of agencies. So, for example, in terms of improving the efficiency and neutrality of our stock, then it's about decarbonising the vehicle fleet. It's about increasing energy efficiency. And there it's obviously a question of working with the industry, the car industry, other industries, utilities, particularly electricity, and also the public transport providers that will be buying the vehicles and operating them. Shift is really the area that local authorities and shire counties and so on have been most focused on, which is about trying to encourage a shift from car to other forms of mobility and the equivalent efficiency and sustainability on the freight side. And there again, obviously, and this is really has been the focus of LTPs in many ways, close discussion with central governments, with transport providers, and also encouraging major trip attractors to introduce travel plans to encourage people to go to football matches or to major employment sites by alternatives to private cars. And then avoid, which is something that's probably only been discussed more recently, about the scope actually for reducing the number and the length of trips through substituting digital for physical meetings, providing some equipment in the home, or enabling people to reach facilities more locally. And to do that, we really need to be talking to the trip generating sectors: education, health, leisure, and retail. And this is the area where, up until date, we've really had rather weak links. As I say, local authorities particularly have been focused on shift, working increasingly with central government and industries to do the improved side, the electrification and so on. But I think this is a real opportunity to start working more closely with the chip generating sectors. We have obviously for a long time recognised the need to try and integrate land use and transport planning, not always successfully. And that obviously is a long-term goal, to actually make sure that our future land use developments are in areas that can be easily reached without relying on a car. But the rate of turnover there is just 1 or 2% a year or growth. That's really important in the long run, but in the shorter term, we think there's scope for working with sectors, as I say, that do generate effectively are the activities that generate travel by the way they organise their services and delivery of goods. And one example, and I think Nicola Kane will touch on this in more detail later on, will be the National Health Service, where 18 months ago they did an audit of their estate. Interestingly, the NHS is responsible for 4% of the country's carbon emissions and 40% of the public sector's carbon emissions. And they did a detailed audit of all their activities, including travel associated with their activities, workers, patients, visitors and so on, and found that 14% of all the carbon they generate is actually comes from travel. And they've taken some responsibility for actually tackling that carbon. I think this is a major breakthrough where trip generating sectors recognise that they are generating transport and carbon and are starting to take responsibility for it. I think that's a real game changer. And one example, very briefly, from Wigan is an exercise that was done 2 or 3 years ago, looking at home care provision in the Metropolitan District. They had 15 different providers, each of which was serving patients all over the district. And they went through a rationalisation, largely because they were finding it difficult to recruit young carers because you needed to have a car, and many of those didn't have a car. And also it's proving increasingly difficult to be able to find parking spaces outside patients' home and so on. So they did a major reorganisation, went down from 15 to 10 providers, and you can see on the right-hand side there that each of those now has a local catchment area, which means that many of those trips can now be made on foot or by cycle. Far fewer need to be made by car. So this has a benefit, obviously, from a transport point of view, opening up the possibility of more active travel and use of public transport, reducing car use. But from a care point of view as well, it's increased the market for carers coming into the system, but also means that they can spend relatively more time with their patients and relatively less time travelling. So really that's a win-win. And I think this is a new opportunity that's opening up to discuss with major trip generating sectors whether we can identify other win-wins that will not only help those sectors achieve what they want, but also help us achieve what we want in transport terms through our future LTPs. And I've talked very specifically about health, but obviously that would apply to other sectors as well, education, tourism, retail, and so on. And just really on the right-hand side to stress that we have engaged with these other sectors a lot during previous LTPs, but very much in terms of what the impact transport is having on those sectors. So the extent to which transport is responsible for pollution or traffic collisions and injuries and deaths, or on a positive side, how transport interventions can actually increase active travel and therefore encourage walking and cycling and help to achieve health targets. That's been around for a while and that's really important, but I'm talking about the other way around, the impact of the activities of a sector on transport and how can those sectors change their service delivery models and investments in order to help achieve transport objectives while also providing better services for their customers and patients. So thank you very much. That was a very quick run through, and I'd like to thank Richard Walker and Peter Stonham, who also provided some information that I presented today. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Peter. A huge amount of food for thought there, and a number of detailed points I think we're going to pick up as we go through the day. Now it's great to have Nicole Barton with us. Nicole is Head of Funding Reform, Design and Delivery for Local Infrastructure at the DfT. And she's going to tell us something about how the department is shaping its new approach and how it will be working with and supporting local transport authorities in the delivery of the next generation of LTPs. Welcome, Nicole, over to you.
Thank you, Peter. So as you said, I'm Nicole Barton. I'm a policy lead in Department of Transport, and within my portfolio is local transport plan policy and of course the work that we're doing on new guidance for local transport policy and the wider process. So today I just want to give you a bit of an overview about what will be new about new local transport plans, what the process and timeline for that will be, and a little bit of context about how this fits into the wider DfT picture. So touching on kind of, picking up where Stephen left off, why are we developing new local transport plan guidance? And I think he talked very briefly about some of the commitments that we've made publicly that are broader than what we've said in the transport decarbonisation plan. But I wanted to talk a bit more about the problem that what we've been seeing and we're facing, and sort of builds on what Peter has been talking about. And we're about to publish some research later this year that will really show some of the kind of issues that we've been experiencing, having spoken to local transport authorities. And we recognise that the cutbacks and delinking of funding means that LTA struggle to prioritise investment in planning. And because of that limits the kind of pipeline of investment-ready interventions. And that then means that when funding does become available, it limits the ability for places to actually secure that funding and spend it in the timescale that funding is available. And of course, the competitive funding landscape creates more uncertainty. We recognise that that's part of the problem. But ultimately, what that translates to is a situation where local networks are not kind of keeping pace with the current transport kind of priorities and challenges, of which decarb is one of them. But there are others. Stephen, of course, mentioned levelling up as well, and growth. So this is part of a much bigger picture, and why the department is taking the decision now to sort of update the 2009 guidance and actually put more focus on local transport planning. So I'm just going to move on quickly to talk about sort of what this process is and the timeline that we're working to. So as I alluded, the team and I are working on new guidance for local transport plans, which replace the 2009 guidance, which is significantly out of date, but also will set out in one place all the objectives for local transport, which have changed and evolved since that last guidance was put in place. And this will be based around sort of existing policies, strategies, and technical documents. And the reason I want to emphasize that fact is because we've been doing a lot of engagement with stakeholders, and we've had lots of calls and asks for things like guidance on demand management. But that needs further consideration, that needs a detailed amount of thinking, and that's not something that we're able to do for local transport plan guidance. So we'll be focused on existing policies and strategies. So I want to set the expectation for that. And the aim is to publish that guidance this autumn, this year, with the aim of still doing further public consultation and refining that to make sure that the document is fit for purpose. But what happens after we publish the guidance? Of course, we recognise it takes time to do a local transport plan properly, and we want to make sure that there's enough time to do that. I think the new guidance also sets the expectation that if you don't already have a bus service improvements plan, a local cycling and walking plan, and the new EV strategy aspects of LTPs, that you're going to need time to implement that. And to do that, we want to set a timeline. We're not reintroducing a schedule for local transport plans to be developed by, but I think for reasons I'll go on to explain, it's helpful for, at this point in time, for everyone to aim for a similar date. And so we're asking local authorities to try and work towards a spring 2024 sort of timeline for developing and their LTPs. Now, I think we should also recognise that local transport authorities are in different places, especially with devolution deals, where that might change the geographies of places. So it's a target date. It's not a absolute must deadline, but we would encourage even those places that are changing to have a provisional plan in place that could be then signed off when, for example, if they're getting a new mayor, that mayor comes on board and signs that off later on. And then the last part of the process, and this is very much a high level process, is what relationship LTPs have to funding in the future. And, I'll put my hands up and say that we haven't done all of the work on this yet, and that will follow after the guidance. But in effect, as we promised in some of the documents that we've already published, we want to make that more central to the engagement between central government and local government about future funding. And of course, there's the transport decarbonisation plan commitment around future funding being kind of conditional on LTPs and quantifiable carbon reductions. But we need to do the work to make sure that that looks right, and we understand the future funding landscape to do that properly. So that will follow after the guidance is in place. And that, we're thinking, is from start to phase in from 25, 26 onwards. So kind of at the start of next Parliament, and especially when a new set of funding is likely to come on board that people will be looking to allocate. So I'm just going to focus a bit on what's new about local transport plans, and particularly starting with the guidance. So we want to, and I'm going to talk through in a little bit more detail and have slides about this that gives a bit more detail. So I'm just going to cover it in a very high level terms. And what I should say before I even start is that this is policy and development. This is our proposals. We still have a little way to go before the guidance even goes out to public consultation, and then it's likely that the guidance will shift and change and evolve after consultation based on the feedback we get from stakeholders. So this is our current thinking. So we want to kind of shift the approach for developing LTPs, and I'll talk a bit more about that. We will focus on a framework of priority outcomes for local transport, and I think Peter Jones sort of highlighted that there were previous iterations of that, and we're just going to present the next iteration. The other aspect of this is, of course, formally making existing modal plans, so bus service improvement plans and local cycling and walking infrastructure plans, part of the kind of suite of supporting documents for LTPs, but also it's about the integration of those with the wider plan. But of course, I think most people most people know, and there is lots of information about those. So I'm not going to talk too much about that on the rest of the presentation. There's a new requirement around EFI strategies. Again, another sort of supporting document to the LTPs, and I'll say a bit more about that. And then there is the transport decarbonisation plan commitment around embedding decarbonisation considerations into the planning process and what we call quantifiable carbon reductions. And our partners, WSP, who have been working with us to develop this part of the guidance, will be presenting I think in the second session, a bit more detail about what that would look like. In terms of the guidance, what's not changing is we're not changing the legislation here. It's still, really important that consultations are comprehensively kind of consulted on, and Peter alluded to some of the kind of sectors and that need to be included in that consultation. And then what we're not doing is taking away the flexibility to deliver in line with local need and priorities. That is fundamental. So we're not going to be telling you should be doing X this way. We will be talking about what you should be considering when coming up with your plan. Of course, it's broader than what's going to be sitting in the guidance. We're thinking about wider support packages to go alongside this, and we've already made £12.6 million available to local authorities at the end of March this year to start kind of preparing for developing their LTPs and to create more capacity, because we recognise that's a challenge. We have, as part of the Levelling Up white paper, committed to providing additional funding to the kind of highest tier kind of devolution deals to kind of help them accelerate their LTP development, recognizing that change might require more changes to their LTP. But there's also the expectation that they will go further and faster than other places who don't get that funding. And of course, we're also thinking about the capability. And I should really thank the subnational transport bodies who've been working quite closely with us on this. There are several of them that are already setting up projects that will offer support to their constituent local transport authorities on how to plan and do that well. And they've also done a lot of work around sort of analytical capability in terms of carbon quantification. And we've really embedded that in what we're doing on our quantifiable carbon, which means that local authorities will be able to go to their SDBs if they have it to help them do the work on carbon quantification. And then finally, of course, is the process change. And we're asking on this occasion that LAs update their LTPs to a set timeline, and that's really to create a level playing field so that when we start to roll out future funding conditions, everyone is in a similar place, and we're all aligned, and we have that totality of a picture at a national level of what investment is needed. So just going into a bit more detail about developing a local transport plan and what the kind of key changes that we're looking to include, and this will be a specific chapter within the LTP guidance that we're preparing. So one of the things will be kind of setting a clearer expectation about the structure of LTPs in the future, and you know, we recognize that almost everyone does a separate strategy and implementation plan or something that looks similar to that, but it's being clear that that needs to be accompanied by a clear kind of pipeline of interventions for investment, and there potentially some shorter documents that will help people sort of look at the documents in at a glance, which a lot of local transport authorities already do with their LTPs, but also some sort of consistent reporting for some of the analytical work that we'll be asking them to do as well. We'll be setting expectation around LTP lifespans, and that's very different to, that's not the same as asking people to update their LTPs at certain times. It's about lifespan, but then we're also going to think about what trigger points should be in place for thinking about when you need to update or effectively redo your local transport plans. I just want to assure people that we recognize if you're in a two-tier authority, that's not about updating your local transport plan every time a local plan comes out, because you may have several planning authorities sitting within your area, all working at different timescales. But we are looking at what level of change to the LTP would trigger an update. One of the things we've been saying from the outset in this is we want LTP to be more like mini strategic cases, and that kind of fits in with it being more central to the discussions we have about funding. And so we're looking at the Green Book to help us do that. We're going to be providing some advice on how you adopt a vision and validate approach. That's not kind of throwing out the ability to forecast and doing forecasting and scenario testing, but it's about some practical advice about how you should approach that that concept. Again, we're borrowing from the Green Book and the Levelling Up Toolkit to include things like place-based analysis and use of option appraisal and filters and theory of change. So you can translate that vision into practical interventions that and achievable and affordable interventions that delivers. And then, of course, there's this importance of aligning with local planning regime. And I would say we haven't yet cracked that, but we are working with Department for Levelling Up Housing and Communities to think about how we can better align them. And then, of course, since the 2009 guidance, regional strategies have completely changed. We had the evolution of STBs and now they're kind of strategies. And so we want to bring that in as part of the kind of wider consultation piece and thinking about. And then the final bit, of course, is a proportionate monitoring and evaluation expectations. I think the 2009 guidance sort of set the expectation that everyone would evaluate their LTPs. There's little evidence that detailed kind of program level evaluations are taking place or can be done. They can be incredibly complex. And I think we've probably taken a step back and thinking about actually it's more of a process evaluation, understanding how you've delivered how the LTP has supported delivery, and then supported by kind of scheme level monitoring and evaluation that sits underneath that. As I alluded to, we're going to be framing the sort of considerations for your LTPs across the sort of the three most relevant strategic priorities that the Department of Transport has: growing and levelling up the economy, improving transport for the user, and reducing environmental impacts. And sitting below this will be a much more detailed kind of description of the policies that apply and go across all of these strategic priorities that should be considered. And I always want to say, you know, when you look at it this way, decarbonisation is really important and central, but it's part of a wider kind of reduce environmental impacts, and we can't ignore things like clean air zones and, you know, adaptation biodiversity, which is all part of that picture. So I won't go into too much more detail on that, and I'll just move on to the next slide, which is just a quick overview of local electric vehicle infrastructure strategies, which, as I indicated, will be a sub-plan to the local transport plan. And this is really about getting local authorities to sort of take ownership of the kind of planning and delivery of EV infrastructure, setting kind of a vision for that, and working across their area to make that happen. There will, of course, be funding provided by central government to support that, but it's also about drawing in private investment, engaging not just with private car users or the public, but engaging with businesses and the fleets that they use and what their needs are. Key to this, of course, is working with local electricity network operators. And of course, the other part of this is integration into the wider environment. Think about pavement spaces, accessibility, making sure if you're going to have wires, there's gullies and things like that to think about, but also sort of other transport considerations, so active travel, bus prioritization, but even parking and the implications for that. And of course, there is the payment aspect of that. So the final slide I wanted to share is sort of just giving you a bit of context about where all this fits in. So if we start on the top right hand side here, new local transport plans is about providing clearer strategic direction from government, but and that's both national and at a local level. And if we move around clockwise, many of you will know that we use an incentive element attached to our highways maintenance funding to drive certain outcomes. And we will be writing out very shortly to you to talk about how that might be evolved to include other sort of to drive other outcomes and priorities, and with an initial focus on LTP development. Moving on to kind of improving and simplifying the funding landscape. We've recently published, of course, 3-year indicative settlements for LAs. I think everyone would like longer than that, but Brexit and COVID made that difficult. We've recently published, of course, the City Regions, the Sustainable Transport Fund, where elected mayors were receiving consolidated funding. And we continue to explore how we consolidate funding for new devolution deals, and of course, more broadly. But also, there's a simplification piece of this. We have actively been trying to reduce the number of smaller competition we have as a department, and bringing together funding, existing funding competitions to make them more consistent. So there's more work to be done there, and that's absolutely part of the picture. And then the final strand of this, of course, is the support to local authorities to deliver. We recognize that because of cuts, because local authorities don't have the capacity, so it impacts their capability. So we're developing regional centres of excellence. We've committed to develop that, and working and having discussions at the moment with subnational transport bodies about how we develop the work that they're already doing into something more consistent and long term. So watch this space. Of course, there's the modal specific stuff, support that we provide, such as the kind of transport, the decarbonisation toolkit, bus centres of excellence, which is all being developed. And of course, there's the revenue funding aspect of this to support sort of capital delivery across, different modes and policies, but also around local transport development and business case development. So I just want to say thank you for taking time to listen to me. And if you would like to know a bit more or would like to be involved in the process, please do feel free to contact us at ltp.plans@dft.gov.uk.
Wow, that's a lot, Nicole. Thank you very much for scoping that all out for us. You're going to be busy, aren't you? And so the local transport authorities in responding to these suggestions and ideas to get the nailed down guidance prepared. I'm sure we'll be returning to discussions like this over the next years as things move forward. Well, I certainly think that Peter and Nicole have set the theme for us incredibly well. And what we thought we'd do now is, before we have a discussion about the content that they put forward, we could quickly ask Greg Hartshorn, who's Director of Transport Policy and Strategy at Atkins, to give us a short reaction as a senior transport practitioner to what he's just heard and how he sees the new LTP regime evolving in that light. And then he'll join the discussion before the break to consider some of these issues. Greg, thanks for coming. Over to you.
Thank you, Peter. Yeah, I'm just going to talk for 10 minutes or so. I haven't got any slides. I just thought I'd talk it through, as it were. A view from the coalface, the practitioner's view, and in particular, I think there's an awful lot of interesting stuff has been said. I think I really want to focus on what I think the opportunities and challenges are that the new regime is going to throw up. And really, this is based on experience that Atkins has had over the last year or so. We've worked with about 10 different local authorities in developing their LTPs. It sounds from what Nicole has said, some of those LTPs that are currently signed off, we may need to be revisiting the structure of them, but we'll see what happens about that. But that may be an issue in itself. But the ones we've worked with have been a mixture of combined authorities and unitaries, and also counties and two-tier areas. So we've got a different view from across various different local authorities. They've got different challenges, of course. Some things are more relevant than others. But I'm just going to pick on maybe 2 or 3 challenges and 2 or 3 opportunities which I'd like to share with you. It's a snapshot. It's our perspective, so these aren't necessarily the views of our clients or anyone else, but this is just a collective view, really, of the practitioners that Atkins have been working on these. So that's the caveats over, I guess. So opportunity 1, it's been spoken about already a lot today, but obviously, without question, carbon and climate change is a huge challenge, and I'll come back to that in a minute. But it's also a massive opportunity, I think, for LTPs to make a really big difference, and maybe gives it a central focus, although of course Nicola's right that there's lots of other outcomes that LTPs need to deal with as well. But in places where we've worked, it's pretty clear that the climate change agenda, and this is the opportunity, I think, has really led to a change of mindset in local government. So things that may have been considered off the table maybe a few years ago in terms of schemes and policies are now being seriously considered, and things like major road schemes are being questioned more, even some of the old ones that have been on the books for quite a while. So I think that's an interesting shift, and that's really been led by officers, I think, who themselves obviously are learning as they go, as we all are. But I think they're working really hard to change the attitudes amongst senior officers, and also members. Explaining the urgency of the challenge and the scale of change that's needed. So it's a gradual process, but I think those messages are hitting home. And I think the best thing to say about the carbon agenda is, okay, there's obviously a need to deliver on the net zero challenge, but often the measures that are applied or relevant to reducing carbon, greenhouse gas emissions, are also really relevant to other outcomes too. So air quality, for example, public health, quality of neighborhoods. So I think there's a bit of a win-win there, that tackling the climate change agenda has a lot of positive spin-offs too in other areas. Second challenge, staying on the theme of outcomes, I think we've also sensed a bit of a shift in mindset about what good looks like. So this may be slightly controversial, but thinking back to the early days of LTPs back around 2000, there was a lot of focus on the quality of the LTP document itself. Performance was really rigorously measured. Peter mentioned APRs, and we all remember comprehensive area assessment, I'm sure, and lots and lots of performance metrics. But a lot of those metrics related to outputs, delivery of outputs, how many meters of guardrail you delivered, or the number of bus stops that were refurbished. And whilst those things are clearly important, I think there's a sense that as long as something was delivered that looked good, then it was fine, and there wasn't really as much attention on the outcomes that delivery was intended to support. Partly because it's really hard to measure in a lot of cases, but I think recently, and again borne out by the climate change agenda, there seems to be much more realization that transport isn't an end in itself, and the LTP should be focusing on delivering those outcomes that have been identified at a national and local level. So I think that's really quite exciting. And then third opportunity, and perhaps something which isn't spoken about much, but a lot of our recent experience in developing LTPs, we've really embraced the integrated sustainability appraisal process, which sits alongside LTPs and has done in various forms over the years, of course, as I'm sure you'll all know. I think actually, historically, it's been something that's been a bit passive, or something that's been done at an LTP, at the end of an LTP process. The need to assess the impact of an LTP environmentally. But what we're doing a lot more these days is integrating the ISA process fundamentally into developing an LTP at every stage of that. And there's an awful lot of benefits of that in terms of making sure that those local environmental policies are embedded really clearly through the objectives and the policies and measures that are in an LTP. I mean, one example for local authority we had recently was that there's a specific policy in the LTP that any bit of infrastructure that's delivered as part of the LTP program has to deliver environmental net gain. So I think there's a big opportunity there to embrace that a lot more in the new LTPs, and hopefully that'll be something that's in the guidance. Just turning to challenges, when we thought about this, we came up with a lot more challenges than opportunities initially, but I'm only going to pick two really. I could have spoken about dealing with peripherality, dealing with local members, integrating LTPs with local planning. They're all challenges, of course, but I don't think there's much argument that reducing carbon emissions is the biggest challenge facing the transport sector, the biggest source of GHGs in the UK, 25% or so. And LTPs have got a really important role in tackling them, but it's a massive challenge. I think we're really only just dipping our toes into now, if I'm honest. So I think the three particular challenges that I've picked up around this, firstly, it's going to take an absolutely massive shift in the scale of travel behaviour to get to net zero. And all the work we've done for local authorities has shown that, and it's been a surprise sometimes to us, and certainly a surprise to some of our clients, members and officers about the level of change that is actually needed. Most of us here today have probably spent much of the last 20 years or so since the first LTPs on planning and delivering measures to encourage use of non-car modes, less use of cars and so on. But the data tells a bit of a sorry story really, because despite all the effort that we've all put into achieving those things, if you look at the use of car, it still remains stubbornly high as a percentage of journeys, and even when fuel prices are rocketing at the moment. So there's a big challenge there about how we as an industry find ways of delivering the behavioural change that we need. It needs to be a collective, and Peter picked up a lot of those points around. There's lots of different influences, not just local transport authorities, who need to be involved in that. Secondly, and I think related to that, not only do we need to deliver a lot of change, but we need to deliver it really quickly at pace. So 2050 net zero may seem like a long time away, but if you happen to have looked at carbon pathways for your area, you'll probably see that you probably use up about 75% of the carbon budget that is available by 2030, which is quite shocking really when you look at it. And in practice, what that means is you have to deliver most of the behavior change that you need to deliver by 2030. So not 2050, but 2030. So that really puts a spotlight on the pace of change that's required. Beyond 2030, we think there's a bit of a shift from behavior change measures to allowing the improved type measures in the avoid, shift, improve framework that Peter talked about earlier, EVs and that kind of stuff, to take more of the strain in terms of delivering the remaining reduction in carbon beyond then. But we don't have much time to play with, so we need to act quickly. We need to move really quickly, I think, from talking about doing this stuff to actually doing it, because we haven't got long left. And thirdly, I think there's a mindset challenge. I think we spent years as transport planners looking to improve physical mobility. My whole career success has been better accessibility. And again, Peter mentioned the accessibility planning tools that were developed for the early LTPs. More travel is seen as good. It's a proxy for access to opportunity and services, or at least the ability to travel was seen as that. So I think the mindset has got to change. If we're going to hit our carbon pathways, we need to rethink that, and perhaps we need to think of ourselves more as accessibility planners rather than transport planners. And in part, I think that's about embracing. You may be aware of Glenn Lyon's triple access model that he's developed, which is the three dimensions, if you like, of accessibility. One is physical travel, physical mobility, and perhaps that needs to become seen as less important, with more emphasis on the other two. So one about proximity, being closer to services and services being provided more locally, and also through digital connectivity, which was also talked about. So these are all quite difficult things to do, and are not things that LTAs can do on their own. And again, the NHS example was a good one in that context. And then just finally, another challenge I would be remiss if I didn't mention is capability and capacity. within the industry. We all know there's a lot to do, and I think all of us, local authorities, consultants, governments, other bodies, the STBs, we all need to learn new skills to understand the emerging issues around carbon, but also levelling up, social value, delivering productivity, economic productivity, and so on and so on. So we all have a role, I think, to develop our capability. And I think some of the tools that have been mentioned, DFTs, the carbon quantification work, and some of the work STBs are doing too, will help with that. But I don't think that's an excuse for us not learning too. So I think the capability needs to be fundamental to how we move forward. But as many of you know better than me, I'm sure, local government's been shrinking. I looked at some figures yesterday, and there's 2 million local government officers in post now compared to 3 million when the first LTPs came around. So the capacity that we've got in the sector to deliver at pace is really quite a big challenge, and probably a constraint on what local authorities can do, either in preparing the LTPs, although funding is welcome for that, but also in delivery. So a big challenge. And I think on top of that, whilst there is greater certainty of funding, and Nicole mentioned the cross-funding 5-year settlement for that and 3 years for ITB, the formula funding is in real terms actually declining, and has to battle with lots of other council priorities outside of transport. So again, a real challenge there to get enough funding and resource to deliver the things that we need to deliver. So I think if we're going to achieve this paradigm shift that we all want, we're going to need a paradigm shift in our capability and capacity as well. So lots of other things I could have talked about, but I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Greg. There's a whole massive amount of comment coming through on the chat now. I think I'm trying to summarize it, but it's hard. I'll tell you, there's questions on detail, but there's a lot about policy integration, both within the transport field and beyond the transport field with other sectors and other local government areas of responsibility. I'm pleased to see that some of your colleagues, Nicole, are responding with answers to some of the points made. And I think we can get the comments stream to you at the end as a document, which might be useful for you to mull over in more comfort, right? 2 or 3 points that are just examples that electric vehicles provision and place management and pavements implications. That's a detail in some ways, but it's a policy level issue. The whole point about placemaking and the neighbourhood design and transport, the relationship with STB policies and in which direction do they feed up and down, and what the STB's role is, and the relationship with local plans with local transport plans, and the timelines and the overlaps. There's a lot of questions saying, can you please come back with something on funding sooner rather than later, and the link between LTPs and funding. There's comments about travel behaviour change, and how the national approach to that and the local approach can be brought together. In other words, the national policy message and mood music needs to be right for the local examples to be put in place. And there are quite a lot of comments about the fact that a lot of what we've been hearing is sort of implied. We're talking about urban areas, and of course a lot of local transport authorities are not just urban areas. And is there anything equivalent to a SUMP without the U in it? Because I haven't seen it myself, but some sort of strategic mobility plan for an area that isn't urban. I don't think I've seen a conceptual model for it, but that might be a useful tool to have. So just going to put a couple of direct questions. Sorry, Nicole, this is going to go straight to you. Lisa Bloomer asks, can the funding relationship element be brought forward at all? This is a key tool to push through the real changes and commitments needed in LTPs now under development. Can I ask you to say if you could imagine a way to get the funding relationship clearer earlier?
So I suppose local transport plans for a long time have not been a guaranteed investment plan, and we're not able to offer that at this stage. But I think we will go away and think about how we can make it clearer, certainly when the guidance comes out, about the expectations about how you should be framing your local transport plan and the investment that's set out in that. I understand people want confirmation, they want certainty, but in the current kind of economic climate and how quickly things change, that's not going to happen in the short term. So we'll have a think about how we can do it, and we've had that feedback from previous sort of engagements with local authorities. Unfortunately, it's about when we can do the work, and also when we can have the conversations about what the future funding landscape and how that evolves. But I think there's something we can do up front to set an expectation about the level of ambition that local authorities should be thinking about in terms of the kind of pipelines and the projects that they're developing.
Thank you. Can I put the point to you, Peter, about tools for looking at areas which are not urban?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Peter. Yeah, I was going to say one thought that came to my mind was that the Scottish government, for example, have set a target nationally of a 20% reduction in car mileage by 2030. And they've sort of produced a toolkit as part of that. And what they've said is they understand that obviously in deep rural areas, there may be a little opportunity to actually reduce travel. It may be a question of electrification. Whereas in the cities, Glasgow, for example, has set a target of a 30% reduction by 2030. So I think that the first thing is to say, obviously, one size doesn't fit all, and it's going to be much more feasible to reduce levels of car use in some areas than others. And that needs to be recognised. Having said that, they're also concerned that in the more deep rural areas, that people have a long way to travel to get services. So they are in discussions about whether, for example, I'd like to take the health example, whether with high quality video links now, more consultations can be done by people visiting a local surgery and then having a video link to a consultant rather than having to travel to Aberdeen or somewhere. So I think there are, although it's clear the balance of measures that can be introduced will be different in different areas, I think there are opportunities actually for reducing some of the trip lengths or need to travel in rural areas, which again would not only help achieve carbon other targets, but also would save long distance travel for patients and customers and so on.
Okay. Just a point that's come in from Stuart Brock. He says to deliver major change at pace surely requires much stronger price signals from government. What we've actually seen price signals that incentivize driving and not public transport. Fuel duty is an example. Does the panel see any likelihood of a national level statements that will help local authorities in their plan preparation on matters such as road pricing and the different incentives to use different modes of transport? Can I ask you, Greg, in the work you've done in your 10 local authority relationships, how have you tackled demand management, and can you see that changing?
Well, I think uncertainty was one of the other challenges I could have spoken about, really, and there are lots of them around demographic change and so on and so on, recovery from COVID and whatever. National policy on things like road user charging is clearly one of those uncertainties. And when you look at the numbers in carbon terms, the impacts of road user charging is significant, or could be significant. So that's how we've dealt with it. You have to look at scenarios really, and what may or may not happen. So more indication from government on that would clearly be welcome. But my personal view is that I think it's just a matter of time before road user charging happens. Partly because of the hole in funding being left by fuel duty and VED, because the switch to electric cars. I'm sure the Treasury are very keen to close that gap. But partly because it offers an opportunity to help with lots of other policy areas like levelling up. If you apply road user charging at a national level in a smart way, you can differentiate between different areas, peripheral versus urban, for example, by journey type, length, time of day, and all the rest of it. So it offers a really powerful tool, and I think the combination of those two things means it's only a matter of time before it becomes too tempting to ignore. Politically very difficult, of course. I doubt that'll happen by spring 2024 when the next LTPs are around. So I think we'll just have to deal with the uncertainty in the meantime. But if Nicole wants to make a government announcement today about road user charging, that would be really helpful.
I was going to, thanks, Greg. I was going to say to Nicole, I don't expect you to make a government announcement, but is there anything you can indicate at all on the thinking process, which is the revenue model that the Treasury must be looking at because of the switch to electrics?
I have to say it's not something I have detailed knowledge on. I think demand management is absolutely part of the picture. And I think the department recognises that and accepts that, but really sees it as a sort of, at this point, as a local decision, but is also exploring national aspects of that as well. So, yeah.
So we've got a few minutes left.
Peter, can I just make a quick comment, if I may? I mean, just reflections from an ivory tower, so maybe right or wrong, that I think there's a perception often that the difficult problems are pushed down to local authorities, and in a sense they take the hit with low emission zones or whatever. And I think authorities would feel they'd like to have, there's more national cover and more national support for what they're doing. And I think the second thing is often, I think the department and others under-recognise the importance of what they say. That actually, a clear decision from central government helps industry and financial to actually line up what they're doing. And I think the power of just a statement from central government, I think sometimes is underappreciated. But just my perceptions from an ivory tower. Thank you.
Well, I might say if there were hundreds of statements in LTPs, that might have the other effect going upwards. So there is sort of game going on here. Who's going to say that firmest thing first? It's what we've had with bus policy over the last few years, where there's been a sort of change of mood in both local and national policy. And what happened between Andy Burnham and Grant Shapps event? Well, it was my idea. No, it was your idea. And I think that's kind of interesting to note the change in interest. National politicians wouldn't have got involved in that a few years ago, I don't think. So I don't know where we are on the demand management and the fiscal regime, but I suspect there will be a change, and it might wait for the election. Greg, is you're right. Can I raise a specific point, which is sort of within your responsibility, Nicole, which is the relationship between all this and things like the transport appraisal guidance, TAG. Obviously, there needs to be consistency between the tools that you use to assess schemes and what goes into the local transport plan. There has been quite a lot of discussion recently about the appraisal process. Can you see an overlap between what you're working on and that?
So absolutely, and one of the key things we've been doing is working with analysts within the department to develop a lot of what the guidance we're developing says, and thinking about what how that aligns with TAG. I think there are wider considerations going on within the department about what future sort of analysis looks like in this space. So it is a constantly evolving approach, and certainly there's opportunities to align that and think about what is best and what is proportionate as well.
Peter and Greg, can I ask you on that one? Peter, you know a lot more about the modelling and the appraisal technicalities. I mean, is there a way that tool can be used on a whole LTP or more readily applied to an LTP?
Okay, I think there's two things. One, there has been an evolution over time. I think historically the perception has been that the economic case has dominated everything else. I think not always true, but that was perception. And I think in the last 2 or 3 years, much more focus has been put on a balance between the strategic case and the economic case. That you might have a strong economic case, but if you've got no strategic case, it doesn't work. So it's brought up the importance of the strategic case, and that's what Nicole has mentioned will be blended into the LTP. So in a sense, the LTP will give the strategic case for justifying the investment. So I think those two will fuse together very, very well. And there was a second point I was going to make about that, which I can't think of for a second now, but that was the main thing about there has been a change of emphasis, and I think it is merging into what's required in the LTP. So I think that's going to work quite well, actually.
Any thoughts on that, Greg?
Yeah, I mean, slightly tangentially, I guess, but I think forecasting the effects of LTPs has always been quite difficult because they're, even from the TPP and the package approaches and stuff that Peter's mentioned, it's the aggregate effect of all those things with some uncertainty over when they're going to happen makes that quite difficult. And some things tend to get forecast better than others where the tools are more developed. What I'm seeing more of is backcasting. Again, something Peter mentioned earlier, I think, where we're tending now to look at where it is we need to get to. Say, for example, that change in journey length or change in number of journeys or mode, whatever it is, and working out, okay, what is it we need to do? What does the evidence tell us to say to the measures we need to employ to get there? So looking at the way around, really. And I think some of the work that's being done at the moment by the STBs and DFT, the Carbon Policy Playbook, is actually about behaviour change. And it's actually about trying to find all the evidence that's out there in terms of the observed behaviour changes to transport and other interventions by location type and by trip type. So there's going to be big gaps in that evidence, I'm sure. But I think that will be a really useful tool to help do that and maybe help some of the issues you're mentioning earlier about the rurality issues.
And just to link Greg's point and Nicole's point, I think it's a question of the role of modelling and appraisal changing in a way. So rather than modelling maybe being focused on saying this is what the future will be, this is what you need to plan for, it's now saying we know what we want to plan for and the models can tell us how to get there. And the scenarios say, well, under different scenarios, what would we have to do to still get to the same endpoint, rather than saying the endpoint would be totally different under different scenarios.
Okay, well, look, we've overrun slightly, but not badly. That was incredibly rich and multi-dimensional. I think it set a wonderful sort of scene for what we're talking about for the rest of the day. We'll be digging deeper into some of these issues from the key challenges and the practicalities as we go forward. We are having a break now. I'm sure people will make their own teas and coffees. I can't supply them from here, I'm afraid. And I'm sure people will want to check their phones and emails. Remember that you can be submitting further questions and comments all the time, and we'll keep an eye on them and pull them out for the conversation. And we'll be back at 11:45 for the next session. Can I thank very warmly Peter, Nicole and Greg for the very excellent start we've had to the day, and have a nice few moments to yourself, and I'll see you again shortly.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.